Hello, my name is Jeff Beaudry and I'm an Associate Professor in the Education Leadership Department here at the University of Southern Maine.
And I'm Anita Stewart McCafferty, an Assistant Professor in Educational Leadership at University of Southern Maine.
And we'd like to present in this video Jan Chappuis, who has been an associate with the Assessment Training Institute, a longtime teacher with wonderful experience in the classroom, as well as leadership positions as a curriculum coordinator and other leadership positions. And most recently, and what we're really trying to take great pride in presenting, is her being an author of some wonderful books. The Castle book, which is the Classroom Assessment for Student Learning, Doing It Right, Using It Well, which is now in its second edition. She's a lead author on that. And the other one, which is really the heart of teaching practice right now, is the 7 Strategies of Assessment for Learning, which is in its second edition. And she's the sole author on that one. Hello, this is Jeff Beaudry. In this video presentation, Jan Chappuis will present the keys to assessment quality. They are broken down into the knowledge and skills that we need to gather accurate information about student achievement and to use these assessment processes and results to increase student learning. The keys to assessment quality are having a clear purpose, clear targets, sound design. Those account for accurate information. The next key is effective communication, and finally, student involvement. The final 2 keys, effective communication and student involvement, are important because those are the processes that allow us to use assessment effectively.
So I love teaching, and when I was a classroom teacher, I loved teaching and I hated assessment. I felt that I was giving with the teaching hand and taking away with the assessment hand. With the teaching hand, I was nurturing learning. Kids were enjoying school. They were engaged in activities that motivated them. And then, boom, here comes assessment. And it seemed to really be Bambi meets Godzilla. Everything that I'd done with teaching seemed to be undone with assessing. Now, I had a pretty tenuous connection in my mind between teaching and assessment when I was a beginning teacher. Many of us see assessment this way, as something that happens after teaching. It's learning neutral at best and harmful to students at worst. For me, and for many teachers, assessment was all about the grade. So we have assessment, and all of our assessment practices lead to grading. However, it turns out that what I didn't like about assessment had a lot to do with what I didn't know about assessment. And as I grew as a teacher, I learned more about how to do assessment right and how to use it well. And it turned out that a lot of what I didn't like was due to the fact that I didn't know how to do assessment right, so I ended up with inaccurate information, which was harmful to students. And then I also didn't know how to use the assessment results in any way other than to grade. So we're going to talk today about really the concept of assessment literacy. The concept of assessment literacy has 2 parts to it: do it right, use it well, make sure we know how to gather accurate information, and then that we can use it not just to measure learning, but also to nurture learning, to support learning. So that's really, in a nutshell, what I didn't know how to do and what many teachers don't know how to do. Over the course of the last 20 years, I've been involved in writing books and in giving presentations to help teachers develop assessment literacy. One of the books is Classroom Assessment for Student Learning, Doing It Right, Using It Well. Co-authored with Rick Stiggins, my husband Steve Chappuis, and Judy Arter. And the other book is 7 Strategies of Assessment for Learning. And the content of what I'll be sharing with you this morning comes from these 2 books. So we can get started here with our presentation. Let's look at Assessment literacy. Assessment literacy can really be captured by 5 keys to assessment quality: the accuracy part and the effective use part. So the first key to assessment quality is clear purpose, and that is, do we know who's going to use the information and how will they use it? And if all we do with an assessment is grade, then if that's all we know how to do, then we are missing one half of the clear purpose key to quality, and that is, there are things we can do with assessment besides grade. Once we understand the different purposes for assessment, then we can move to Key 2 clear targets. Key 2 clear targets simply means that before I set out to design an assessment or administer it, I need to be clear about what learning targets I'm teaching to. And then I need to design an assessment to make sure that the assessment actually measures what I taught. So that's Key 3 sound design. And in Key 3 sound design, we look at, have I chosen an assessment method that matches the target I intend to teach? Have I created that assessment with standards of quality in mind? Different assessments have different standards of quality. And so in the accuracy side, we have 3 keys: clear purpose, clear target, and sound design. And we need to know we need to develop assessment competencies in each one of those 3 keys in order to ensure that our data is accurate. And then we move over to the effective use side. Now, the effective use side, we have effective communication. Grading fits there, certainly. Summative communication is about grading. And when we've done grading well and formative assessment well, where we are looking at using the results and communicating the results for formative purposes, we first go to, we look at purpose. And if you could advance the slide, you'll see we have a little arrow there. There we go. So Key 4 effective communication really begins with, what's my purpose for assessment? Therefore, how am I going to communicate the information? And then we move from effective communication to clear targets. Am I sure that I am communicating about the targets that I'm teaching? Do my grades and my feedback and all of my communication reflect achievement on valued learning targets? The third consideration is, have my assessments been designed so they can support the communication I need to do? If it is tended to be formative, are my assessments designed with instructional traction in mind so they help me determine what to do next? If it is summative, is the design set up so that I can translate my results into a standards-based grade? The last key to quality on the effective use side is student involvement. And student involvement is really about each one of the other 4 keys to quality. So if you could advance the slide, we'll see that we have an arrow that connects student involvement and clear purpose. So with student involvement, we ask in clear purpose, have we thought about the student as an assessment user? When we ask the question, who's going to use the information and how will they use it? Is the student one of our intended users? And then with clear targets, have we made the targets clear to students? Without clear targets, without students understanding the target, we can't provide effective feedback. They certainly can't self-assess and set goals. And it turns out that we lose a lot of motivation to learn if we skip the step of helping students understand what it is they're supposed to learn. And then with student involvement and Key 3 sound design, we think about designing, if students are intended users of the assessment results, then how do we design our assessments so that students can look at their own results and say, here's what I'm good at, here's what I've mastered, and here's what I still need to work on. So have we considered in our design of our assessments the use that the students might make of them in terms of self-assessment and setting goals? And then last, in effective communication. Not only do we want our effective communication to students in the form of feedback to encourage further learning, but we want students to be able to track their own learning, to reflect on it, and then to share it as well. So that is our five key structure for assessment competencies that we need to have in place in order to have an assessment literate culture. Many of these concepts were missing from my from my own personal practice, and I think that in large part that is one of the reasons that I did not enjoy assessment at all. And if you can think back to your own experiences as an assessor in the classroom, most of us did not go into teaching in order to assess. Most of us do not generally put the words assessment and joy in the same sentence. Most of us think about assessment as something that happens, that teaching might be able to happen without assessment. And it turns out that teaching can happen without assessment, but learning doesn't happen so well without assessment. So we're going to look a bit at effective summative use as an example of how these 5 keys to quality are necessary for anything we intend to do with assessment results. So let's use standards-based grading as our example, because standards-based grading is something that we know we want teachers to be able to do with assessment information. It turns out that standards-based grading is not isn't accomplished by teaching people how to do standards-based grading. How do we do standards-based grading really hinges on, do we know how to track learning by standard? So in order to do standards-based grading, we need to be able to track our students' learning target or content standard by content standard. Standards-based tracking relies on a foundation of standards-based assessment. If our assessments are not aligned directly to the content standards we're teaching to, then we won't be having an assessment that reflects the standards student had opportunity to learn, and we won't be able to track by standard. We'll be stuck tracking by category or just tracking grades in a subject. Standards-based assessment relies on a foundation of standards-based teaching. Now, this doesn't always happen. We often have standards-based assessments that have been prepared and teachers administer them, but they may not be a direct match to the teaching. And when that happens, we have assessment results that don't reflect what students had opportunity to learn. And if we use those results and create a grade, then we have graded kids on things that they didn't practice or didn't learn. So standards-based grading requires standards-based tracking, which requires standards-based assessment, which is best done in conjunction with standards-based teaching. And standards-based teaching requires standards-based planning. In order to teach to the standards, I need to be able to plan with those standards, to look at those standards and say, how can I take them apart so that they are at the lesson level? What am I going to do first? What am I going to do next? What are the students going to practice? So at the standards-based planning stage, we're really deconstructing the content standards so that students we're able to not just say, okay, here's this huge content standard and this is what we're going to learn. And then we don't really have a roadmap to how to get there. So standards-based planning is really about creating that roadmap that gets us to the attainment of the ultimate content standard. Standards-based planning hinges on having a clear understanding of the content standards. So you can see here that standards-based grading isn't just an effective use strategy or competency. It really relies on a foundation of clear targets, as does all assessment. So standards-based grading requires assessment literacy in order to get there. Now, on the formative side, when we look at the formative side of assessment, effective formative use. So we're still in key 4, effective use of information, effective communication, and we're thinking about the formative side of it. Now, as you know, and as many researchers have been sharing with us over several decades, formative assessment practices into 3 categories. Basically, when we are assessing for formative purposes, we have one of three possible uses of that information. And the first one is to figure out where students are in their learning in order to know what we're going to do next to increase that learning. Where are their strengths, where are their problems, and what are we going to do about it? Many of the practices that you're familiar with that fall under the banner of formative assessment are whiteboards, clickers, data-driven decision-making. Those fit into that category. However, there are other categories of high-impact formative assessment practices that involve the student more directly. And the first one is, as I'm sure you're familiar with, that we need to make sure we're providing effective feedback to students during the learning that offers guidance on how to improve. Now, in the research on feedback and how it can improve student learning, it isn't the giving of feedback that causes the gains. It's the acting on feedback that causes the gains. So we need to make sure when we are in the formative assessment side of the equation that we're providing enough time not only to give that feedback, but for students to act on it. No action, no gain. And the last category is developing student self-assessment and peer feedback skills. Much research has focused on the value of helping students to self-assess, to look at where they are, what am I good at, what do I need to work on, and also to work with their peers on collaboratively talking about their work and saying, what does this show? I know, where do I have something mastered, and where are the areas that I need to take next steps. So that's our equation really for, or the three high impact categories of formative assessment. So we have on the one hand, on effective use, we have making sure that our grades are communicating effectively. And on the other hand, we have making sure that when we are using assessments formatively, that we are moving beyond just looking at the data to taking action, both ourselves and our students. When we put the teacher and the student action together, we can think about formative assessment in terms of 7 strategies.